Hello everyone, my name is Courtney Cox, and the article that I will be talking about today is called "A Normal Intensity Level of Psychophysiological Stress Can Benefit Working Memory Performance at High Load" by Lai and colleagues. They conducted a study looking at the effects of stress on working memory performance. They wanted to know if the effects of stress depended on a person's memory load and how long the retention interval is. They used an acute psychophysiological laboratory stressor in order to make the participants of their study have the normal stress effects. They used a modified version of the Sternberg working memory test to control the number of images stored in the participant's memory, as well as the length of the retention interval. Now I'm going to talk about some of the past research in this area. Most of the previous research that was done in this area consists of definitions of what stress, workplace stress, and working memory are. Some of the research that the authors discussed in this article even made suggestions about the causes of the effects of stress on memory. So what is stress? What does stress actually mean? Stress is your body's natural response to any stressor or demand that's placed on it. We have all experienced stress in our lives. We get stressed because of many things, such as school or something going on in your personal life. Your job can even cause you to be stressed. This is also known as workplace stress. Workplace stress is when your personal needs and your job demands do not match, which can lead to harmful physical and emotional effects. According to Lai and his colleagues, stress can have many effects on your memory. However, with just the right amount of stress, it can also have benefits such as a decrease in errors. So now let's talk about what working memory actually means. A person's working memory is information that is temporarily stored that has just been experienced or has just been retrieved from your long-term memory. The storage of information in your working memory can be separated into two subsystems that are visual information and verbal information. The capacity of working memory is very limited. It can only store information for a short period of time unless you practice it. This is also known as rehearsal. Working memory is very important for cognitive functions such as learning, planning, and reasoning. Now let's talk about some of the causes that some past researchers had found about the effects of stress on a person's memory. Some researchers suggested that stress on memory is caused by the activation of glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. Others have said that it is because of the activation of the prefrontal cortex that causes these effects. The hippocampus is very important in memory processing, and it is also very susceptible to stress. Other researchers have found that the medial temporal lobe is activated during a working memory task. Now I'm going to discuss what the author's research question and hypotheses are for their study. So, Lai and his colleagues wanted to know, does the effects of stress on working memory performance depend on a person's memory load and how long the retention interval is. The article states that the length of the retention interval is determined by how high a person's memory load is. The authors hypothesized that the effects of stress on working memory performance would be at a long retention interval, otherwise known as having a high memory load. They also hypothesized that the effects of stress on working memory performance is influenced by high and low levels of intensity. Now I'm going to talk about the methodology of this study. The participants of this study were 12 young and healthy male medical students. Their ages ranged from 21 to 25 years old. The mean age was about 22. All participants were right-handed and had no significant health or psychiatric conditions that could affect their brain function. There were no women included in this study. All participants in this study were asked not to drink alcohol and to not do extreme physical exercises one day before the study took place. They were also told to not eat anything or drink caffeine 1 hour before the experiment. The Medical Ethics Committee approved this study, and all of the participants provided informed consent before they decided to participate in this study. This study took place at a climate control laboratory at the University of Occupational and Environmental Health in Japan. Now I'm going to discuss the 2 conditions of the study. There were 2 conditions in the study that participants had to undergo. The conditions were stress and control. The participants underwent these 2 conditions on 2 different days. In the stress condition, the participants had to give an introduction about themselves that was 2 minutes long. They had to do this in a foreign language and in front of people that they did not know. These introductions were also recorded on a video camera. After introducing themselves, the participants then had to put their right hand in ice water for 1 minute. This was also recorded. In the control condition, the participants did not have to introduce themselves for 2 minutes in front of people that they did not know. They only had to put their hands in warm water for 3 minutes. They were not being recorded on a camera. After the participants underwent both conditions, they had to rate how stressed they felt as well as how much pain they were in on a scale from 0, not at all, to 100, extremely stressed or extremely painful. Now I'm going to talk about the Sternberg working memory task. Lai and his colleagues used this working memory task to test working memory performance. The authors of this article state that the stimuli that they used were complex sync images against a gray background. Each participant performed 80 trials in total that took about 20 minutes each. There were 3 phases in each trial. These phases are encoding, retention interval, and retrieval. I will now discuss each of these phases in more detail. the encoding phase, the participants had to try to remember either 2 or 5 images. During the retention phase, the participants were not looking at any images. They had to look at a blank screen instead. They had to look at this screen for either a short period of time or a long period of time. Lastly, in the retrieval phase, participants had to say whether they recognized the images that they were being presented to them from the encoding phase. In order to do this, they were told to press a yes key if they recognized it. This was called a match trial. If they did not recognize an image, they would press a no key, which was called a non-match trial. Now I'm going to talk about the variables that Lai and his colleagues tested in the study. They tested heart rate, systolic blood pressure, and diastolic blood pressure using a blood pressure monitor. They also They also conducted a salivary cortisol analysis in order to look at the effects of stress on HPA system responses. Saliva samples were collected and then stored until they could conduct a biochemical analysis. Another thing that Lai and his colleagues looked at was electroencephalogram recordings, or EEG, which is what I will be calling it for the rest of this presentation. They used the Polymate 2 app 2216 system for all EEG recordings. These recordings were made during the retention interval. Another thing that they looked at was near-infrared spectroscopy, or NIRS. NIRS stands for a non-invasive evaluation of regional oxygen saturation, or RSO2. Lai and his colleagues used this to evaluate prefrontal cortex activity during the working memory task. Now I'm going to talk about the experimental procedure of this study. Before the testing began, all participants signed an informed consent form. They then performed the 2 conditions, the stress or the control test. This took about 20 minutes. They then had to do the Sternberg working memory task, which also took about 20 minutes. The researchers recorded the EEG and NIRS while the participants were performing the working memory task. To analyze their data, Lai and his colleagues first calculated correct accuracy by looking at the hit rates and false alarms from the retrieval phase of the Sternberg working memory task. They did this by subtracting the number of match trials from the number of non-match trials. They ran a 3-way repeated measure ANOVA in order to look at the effects of stress on working memory. Reaction time and accuracy was also used in this analysis. This analysis consisted of 3 factors: stress versus control, low memory load versus high memory load, and short retention interval versus long retention interval. The SPSS version 16.0 2.0 was used to analyze all of the data from this study. Next. The last thing that I will be talking about in this presentation is the results. What did Lai and his colleagues find in their study? They found that the two conditions increased salivary cortisol, whereas the working memory task did not. It actually decreased it. The results of this study show a significant increase in heart rate after participants finished the stress conditions. However, this did not happen after they finished the control condition. There were also differences in systolic and diastolic blood pressure between the two conditions. All participants who underwent the stress conditions felt more stressed than those who underwent the control condition. The researchers of this study also found that the stress conditions showed a larger difference in the length of the retention interval than the control condition. The stress condition also showed a faster reaction time than the control condition. The EEG recordings had an effect on high memory load, long retention intervals, and in the right hemisphere of the brain. NIRS also had an effect on the right and left frontal lobes of the brain. Overall, the results of this study show that acute psychophysiological stress does have an effect on working memory performance. Thanks for watching my presentation.